When I first went to China, to Beijing in 2012, I was probably extremely naive in terms of what I would be expecting on arrival. I was very much a tourist then and stayed in a hotel. I was participating in an exhibition, and so it was quite an unreal experience. When I went back in 2014, I went back as a resident of Redgate art studios and lived on the edge of a village and had to do things like go shopping, learn to travel on public transport, go to art supply stores, and it became a much more real experience. I kept a sketchbook while I was there, and when I returned I was able to work from a lot of those original ideas. But I found China a really very new experience for me. I hadn't really travelled much in Asia apart from Thailand, so China offered me something that was extremely stimulating.
Contrary to my expectations, which were actually to find a unified country that Mao sort of like brushed over or airbrushed over all changes and differences, I found an extremely diverse country. I saw these amazing sculptures that were carved hundreds of years ago, or maybe even thousands of years ago, and they were protected by the Mao regime. This was again unexpected because I thought that all ancient culture was sort of destroyed by Mao. And on the surface of it, I found this country that was very different from anything I've ever experienced. But it was a country with the gaps between poor and rich, urban communities and rural communities. Sort of on the surface of it looked like a normal country going about its business, with no evidence of this communist regime suppressing their everyday life.
I grew up around these various objects and artifacts that my grandmother had brought back from China from her trip in 1936, and my mother visited communist China in 1958. So I have their diaries, and I think I'd imagined all sorts of extraordinary things about this idea of my mother and grandmother in China, partly through the objects, but also through the stories, which were quite luminous to me as a child. It was an interesting idea to go to China myself and have 3 generational accounts, but the real world experience of China seemed to have hardly anything to do with this rich imagined world that I had partly been given and partly created.
The most significant experiences were going to see the terracotta warriors. On the second trip I went to the Forbidden City and visited the clock museum. Visiting there was incredible because I came back and realised that the clocks had really inspired me. I also visited the Beijing Natural History Museum. And what was extraordinary there was a series of babies in different stages of gestation in utero, in a way reflected a body of work I'd done in the past in bell jars.
The main influence was seeing the relics of the ancient culture. The terracotta warriors have been well documented, but seeing them in the place where they found coming out of the dust and the ashes, some of it fragments, some of it restored, was a completely different experience and quite an overwhelming one. And next I went to another burial site, and there were about 80 digs coming out of the center that were quite deep, and inside them there were doll-sized warriors without their hands because their hands were from wood and they deteriorated, rotted, and thousands of animals and all kinds of other things that the emperor would need in the afterlife.
The first place that we went to was not at all what I expected. We drove out of this big modern airport in Guilin, and within 2 or 3 hours we're in quite a remote area. in villages that could only be reached by walking. And they were so beautiful. The people carried goods up and down these exquisitely laid paths using huge baskets or donkeys, as they had done for hundreds of years. And it was an agrarian community with rice terraces that was so much a part of the land. It was very beautiful. It was a contrast to my expectation of China with its environmental problems and so forth. It was a very interesting experience to be there. And these minority groups had been driven into the hills away from the more desirable flat land, but their isolation had created something really remarkable.
Every day on the return to the hotel room, there would be a little card, a business card under the door with a photo of a very attractive young woman, and with a series of numbers printed across it, which I presume was a phone number. And I assume they were of hostesses. So I actually did some drawings in my sketchbook, put these also these business cards in my sketchbook, and called it the Under the Door Hostess series. And on return to my studio, I actually made a series of these hostesses as paintings, as works on paper. And I incorporated my one of myself when I would have been around the same age. And so this came about, this series, as a result, a direct result of that experience. Also, I loved the way the bicycles were used in China. They were used not only to get the individual around, but they were used to carry the whole family around. And I have a memory of a whole family on a push bike, with the father pedaling, the mother sitting on the saddle, and the child on the crossbar eating its bowl of noodles.
In this body of work, I decided to incorporate some materials and some technique that I've seen in China. First, rice paper. So I decided to get some of the images I took in China of the warriors and screen printed them on rice paper, and then incorporated them into elements of the landscape or the natural environment or the forces that act upon the landscape and would have acted upon the warriors. Second, I suddenly felt an urge to make three-dimensional objects. So, and here I used another of the technique that I saw in China, the mold making a mold and using the mold to create a multiple object. And in this case, angels. I decided to use the angel as a metaphor, or maybe a response to the warriors. So I'm creating an army of angels. The third object that I've used that I'm making is repository boxes. Now the work intends to be a cross-cultural dialogue between East and West. And I'm creating these repository boxes that might look like an open book and might revisit my idea of concave convex that I've been dealing for over years. And creating a space that I personally put images of the warriors and ideas about burial practices across cultures.
We had an opportunity to visit a school where they did traditional silk painting, as it had been done for a long time. The extraordinary discipline and delicacy of that work really affected me. I found that very impressive. And also, there's a scale of things in China, the scale of everything, numbers of people, but also of the history, also of the landscape, the cities, and also the artwork. Everything appears, you can see everything huge. The other aspect of vastness that I think occurs in the tradition of landscape painting is that the vastness of nature has its spiritual correlations. And that's something I find really interesting in the tradition. There's a reverence for wilderness, for different types of landscape, and a finding of different principles within that. So that's something that has influenced the way that I think about the way that I do my work.
My art is always very much personalised. It's very much about me and the experience of having done something or had something happen to me or having travelled somewhere. So whenever I travel, it's always reflected in my work. There's always a body of work comes afterwards. So having the opportunity to be in an exhibition, Three Women Went to China, has given me a focus to really spend, ever since I travelled to China in 2012, to be completely focused on the experience of China. I've only ever deviated once, and that was for two small pieces of work to be included in a group show. Everything else has been very much about China, and in fact those two works also could well easily be incorporated into the Chinese work.
My artworks are a result of both guts respond and a certain narrative. But initially I would follow an urge. In this case, I was first drawn to the aesthetic of the relics, their age-worn or the dust, and the fact that they are part of a history that I knew very little about. And I tend to relate to the place that I come to through the landscape. So I find that the landscape has a lot to do with the way we form our culture. And in this case, it was quite interesting to find how the burial pits would have been influenced by the location and by the setting that they have been chosen to be in.
I initially, of course, was attracted to all of those things that were very typically Chinese, but when I came to working with those in the studio, they seemed very superficial. I was very attracted to karst landscape. I went and saw and photographed that landscape, but it seemed like reproducing an aesthetic that was not my own, that didn't belong to me culturally at all. And so eventually I had to look for something that was more universal. And I have worked with glacial landscapes for a long time, but I realised that they are, in a sense, outside dominions, and there is a way in which the glacial landscapes of the planet are similar the world over. And so I brought that notion and the notion of journey together in the Traverse series. I think of the outer journey, which is what I have painted in these groups, as being metaphoric of the inner journey. And the inner journey is that one that we all undertake, and that does include the distortions of memory.
Those two trips to China have influenced the way I see a lot of potential in found objects. And when I was going to these everyday shops in China, I would find a wooden plate stand or a bamboo steamer or brushes or whatever. And I realised that these could actually not only influence me in becoming subject matter for my work, but they could actually be utilised as objects in the construction of sculpture, or they could influence, by looking at those, they could influence what I looked for when I visited second-hand shops to get stimulating materials to use in my sculptural pieces.
I can't say that the trip or the trips or making the work about China has changed my practice profoundly, but it added quite a lot of layers and depths to the way I engage with my work. The sense of history is quite important for me, and I think the same way is by engaging with the archaeological relics that were discovered in China, is engagement with history in a way that I think only art can do in a very unique way and give us some different kind of meaning.
I think that the trip to China and what I call an encounter with a profound otherness has brought me closer to thinking about what the things are in human experience that are universal. And I think there's a way in which everywhere human beings have grappled with the reality of the landscape that they find themselves in, and that I was looking for something, because my mother and my grandmother visited China at such particular times politically. I was trying to think about what the struggle of our time really is.